today, like I mentioned, we're gonna talk a little bit, since we have the time together, about potassium management and some micronutrients as well. And then we'll kind of jump into what we need to be doing to wrap up the nutrient management plan. So let's talk a little bit about potassium. Is another nutrient that we find to be commonly deficient on a lot of soils. Ooh, let's see here. The potassium cycle itself is pretty straightforward. We've talked a lot about potassium throughout the class, you know, the fact that it has that positive charge and it can hang on to the soil charges. It can hang on to the clays and be held on by organic matter and move onto and off from those binding sites pretty readily. And of course, it has to make it into the soil solution again to be able to be taken up by the plants. So, you know, much of what we already talked about before with the other nutrients and the cation exchange capacity just reviewed here. And we know that potassium, of course, can be given to our crops through manure application, compost, and then, of course, mineral fertilizers as well. Potassium does, if you're an organic farmer, there certainly are a number of organic potassium fertilizer sources available that I don't want to say are cost effective, but certainly more cost effective than some of the other nutrient sources we have available in organic. So if you are really deficient in potassium, there are lots of different ways to be able to add it to the soil. It does leach pretty readily, especially on light textured soils, not so much in clays, but on those river bottom soils, you know, those silty, or I'm sorry, loamy, sandier soils, you get a lot of potassium leaching. It becomes a problem trying to, you know, constantly battle low potassium. I know up in the Northeast Kingdom, you know, we generally see a lot of low potassium soils that need to be managed to add potassium almost every year. We do get, especially on clays, you get a lot of fixed potassium in between the clay layers. So here's a picture here. You see this 2-to-1 clays. So these 2-to-1 clays are sort of stacked in layers, and the potassium can actually get stuck pretty tightly between those layers. So sometimes, you know, on those heavy clays with long time or long-term application of liquid manure in particular, you can see really high potassium levels. It is kind of slowly available when it gets stuck in between those clays. But the other thing, of course, about clay is that it has a lot of negative charge. So it also just holds on to a lot of potassium, kind of gets stuck all over it, in between, on the sides. And so it, you know, those clay soils really hold on to that potassium. And so if you're on a heavy clay soil with, you know, manure application year after year, you will generally see pretty high potassium levels on those soils. But, you know, I will say I do see a lot of potassium deficiencies around the state in many of the crops that we grow. I see it in corn a lot. It commonly gets kind of often misidentified as nitrogen deficiencies. But if you're, again, are on those light textured soils that are low in potassium, it can be really hard to make it through an entire growing season, often having enough potassium in those soils. You can see some deficient plants here. Legumes in particular too are also really needy for potassium. They have really high potassium requirements. Alfalfa, as you know, is a really high potassium user. Soybeans, any legume really will have high potassium needs that should be met for those crops, or else, you know, of course, you're going to see some deficiencies. And certainly in the case of alfalfa and some of the other legumes too, the potassium does play a real critical role in winter survival, especially for alfalfa, you know, acting as sort of an antifreeze in the roots. And so managing potassium in those legume crops is really important for productivity and success. So we talked last week quite a bit about nitrogen and growing legumes and how important that is, you know, in our agricultural system. A really great way to increase feed quality and also produce nitrogen that can help lower your commercial nitrogen purchases or nitrogen needs of the grass, you know, when we grow legumes. But in order to have really highly productive legumes, they also need potassium, you know, so you need to make sure you're paying attention to, again, what the crop needs. And if your soil test is saying you need potassium, you need to get it on the ground for those crops to be successful. And again, you know, these legumes need that pH as well. So when I hear people talking about how they just can't keep legumes in their fields, you know, you have to manage for them like you do anything else. So taking care of the potassium levels of the soil, the pH, not over applying nitrogen will help those legume stands last. But I will say that they definitely, you know, improved legumes, I guess. So new seedings of alfalfa, red clover, white clover, you know, we do find that they will die out pretty quickly often, you know, over a 3 to 4 year period. So, you know, making sure you're meeting their requirements, but also knowing that a lot of legumes need to be renovated quite often, more often than our grasses do. You know, often our fields will revert back to that really low growing white clover and a lot of Kentucky bluegrass. And it, you know, certainly can be productive in some cases, but, you know, if you want those improved varieties out there, you definitely are going to have to work at it. They don't just hang out, you know, for 25 years. That's kind of a tangent. Sorry about that. All right. So again, you know, potassium is one of those cations that we were looking at on our soil tests, where we were looking at the bases and the base saturation. I'm not sure if you remember that. You've learned a lot, where we were looking at the amount of calcium on the exchange sites versus the amount of potassium versus the amount of magnesium. And those ratios are squiggle line on my computer screen. It looks like a little piece of yarn. I don't know what it's doing there, but those ratios of those bases, the calcium, magnesium, and potassium, can have a significant impact on the concentration of those nutrients in your forages. And then if those concentrations are out of balance and your animals are eating them, then that can have an impact on your herd health, right? And I'm sure many of you who have livestock have had milk fever, or maybe grass tetany in the spring. All of those metabolic disorders are a result of an imbalance of those cations in your animals, right? But generally that starts in some cases with what those animals are being fed. So we're always trying to make sure that we can balance that in the soil and in the forages so that the animals don't get sick. Now, when you have too much potassium and low levels of, you know, calcium or magnesium, you can have issues again in the nutrient concentration of your forages. So it is really important to pay attention to these things, because a lot of these issues can often be reconciled in the field. So I mentioned this before, if your soil test is calling for magnesium to be added, you should add it, because clearly your soils are deficient. And if then they're really high in potassium, that can cause some issues, especially on grazing farms. You know, in the spring, when you put the animals out, those plants will be really low in magnesium, really high in potassium. And then you get these issues around grass tetany. So paying attention to those ratios is really important. I already mentioned a little bit about alfalfa management, or potassium management in alfalfa and other legumes too, but in particular alfalfa has a really high demand for potassium. It can remove quite a lot. And as I mentioned, it also plays an important role in the overwintering of that crop, kind of helping to move carbohydrates into the roots, essentially making it ready to prepare and make it through a very long winter. So if you're like most of our farms, if you have a grass legume mix, your grasses are going to compete with your legumes for that potassium, and they're really good at it. I mean, you guys have seen the root system of grasses, right? It's super fibrous roots, lots of them. They're more capable, I guess, more efficient at taking up potassium than the legumes. So if you're already low on potassium in a grass legume mixed field, the grasses are going to get that potassium, leaving your legumes short, right? So again, managing that potassium is really, really important, especially if you want to keep those legumes growing well in the fields. I wanted to talk a little bit about different ways that different people look at recommending nutrients to farmers, right? Maybe ways you might look at it too, people that you work with, and even, you know, folks like us at the university. There's lots of different approaches, and we've kind of touched on each of these throughout the various presentations that I've given, but potassium itself is a nutrient where I can really show these different approaches really well. So when people make nutrient recommendations, they go about it in usually 3 different ways. So we have this sufficiency approach, which is generally what you see on most soil tests, where we're just trying to maintain kind of critical level of a nutrient. Then we have a maintenance approach, which is where people look at what the crop is removing. And so you've seen both of these numbers, right? You've seen what the soil test recommends, and then you've also seen what the crop removes, and they're not the same number, right? So the maintenance approach is basically when people look at what the crop takes off of that field, and then they just put that same amount back without recognizing what might already be in the soil. Okay. And then the sufficiency approach looks at maintaining a critical level of the exchangeable nutrient based on what's in the soil, basically, and then what the crop needs. Then there's this third approach, which is the soil cation balance approach. And this particular approach is just looking at those 3 cations that we've been talking about and trying to keep them in certain ratios. So I mentioned this weeks ago when we were looking at it, that generally people say that if you have the sites, those binding sites covered, you know, with 80 to 90% calcium, maybe a little lower, and you have those sites covered with 10 to 12% magnesium and 2 to 4% potassium, that's ideal. And so people will strive to meet those ratios. Now, I think you can probably imagine that using all three of these is probably the way we should look at our system as a whole, right? It's not just one way or the other way. So through nutrient management, we've actually been using all three of these approaches to develop recommendations for your crops. And that generally is the way that most universities go about making recommendations. You know, we kind of look at what the crop needs, what the crop's going to remove, what's in the soil. But then we also look at these balances, right? Because of some of the things I just talked about. If you're low on magnesium and too high in potassium, you're probably going to see on your soil test to add magnesium. Okay, so your university recommendation that you have is actually using all three of these approaches. So here's just kind of a picture of the sufficiency level where we look at your soil test levels and we know that there's an optimum. And if we're at that optimum, we won't see or predict that we won't see much of a crop response. Okay, so that's one of the approaches and approach that we've been using in this class. And then of course, this maintenance approach is that we look at this large amount of nutrients that the crops remove, and then we add all of that back. Okay. So the problem with doing that, if that's the only thing we looked at, especially with potassium, is the fact that crops will luxury consume potassium. So what does that mean? It means that if you apply a lot of potassium, okay, usually the crops, alfalfa does this too, and grasses do this as well, will just keep consuming it. You know, they don't know when to turn off the switch. This isn't generally the case with the other nutrients, but the crops will do this with potassium. So they luxury consume this nutrient, which obviously can be a waste. It's wasteful for the plant, but it's also wasteful if you're applying too much fertilizer, right? And you're looking at what the crop removed and putting back. So if you looked at how much potassium, let's say, you know, your grass crop removed, and then you put that back, that grass crop could have luxury consumed potassium, meaning it just took up more than it actually needed. So you can see where using that crop removal rate is not really a good idea in the case of potassium. Now, for other nutrients, we do use that, like nitrogen as an example. Okay, so because plants can luxury consume potassium, this is also where we run into issues with these nutrient imbalances, right? If there's so much potassium and less of the other nutrients, the crop's just going to keep taking up that potassium. It can outcompete the other nutrients going into the plant, making that plant deficient in magnesium, in calcium. And I think we know what then happens if you're feeding this to livestock. Okay, so again, if you're just using the replacement value for potassium and you were looking at a 5-ton crop, and if that crop was 2% potassium, then the removal rate would be 240 pounds of potassium, okay, or 48 pounds per ton. And again, if you looked at a different crop and it had 3% potassium, then you would be putting on 300 pounds. But the reality is that that crop only needed 2, right? But it took up 3. So you can see where you could easily get into trouble over applying nutrients, looking at replacement value only. Right. So as I mentioned before, potassium is pretty readily available. You know, it's in manure, quite a lot of it. In commercial fertilizers, it's easy to access. And basically with relatively high analytics or analysis. So even in organic production, you can buy a 0052. So you're able to meet, or should be able to meet, the potassium needs of your crops. I want to say relatively easy. That doesn't mean it's not without expense. Okay. One thing that people should definitely consider, especially if you need a lot of potassium, some of you might see potassium recommendations up in the 200 pound per acre range, depending on, you know, your soil type and the crop you're growing, is that you're really going to want to consider split applications, right? If if your soil test says you need 200 pounds of potassium and you add that entire 200 pounds, right after first cut, let's say, that plant's going to luxury consume that fertilizer, okay, and then not leaving enough there for subsequent crops. So really, if you have high potassium needs, you should be considering split applications so that you reduce luxury consumption, but also reduce that potential for leaching in those sandier soils. And if you remember from a few classes ago, I believe, if you have, low pHs, it's impacting, the availability of nutrients. And generally, if you lime, you're going to see a release of potassium. So you'll see those numbers go up a bit. As I mentioned, again, I guess a lot of this is repeat. We do see a flush of potassium in the spring. So it gets kind of flushed out with freezing and thawing cycles, in particular here, out of those clays, some of that potassium that's held on in between those clay layers or stuck onto the soil sites, things that maybe weren't available, become quite available in the spring, right? And there generally tends to also be a good amount of water around. So there's more potassium available generally in the spring. So during that first cut in particular. And then those levels decline quite rapidly across the season. So you can see this blue line is the level of potassium going down across the season in the forages, right? And then the other levels of nutrients going up. So you can see, of course, again, if you have these imbalances in your soil, or you have a lot of potassium and those potassium levels are really high, your plant is just going to take up a lot of potassium and it's going to minimize the uptake of these other nutrients. So potassium management is really critical. And so the other thing I wanted to note here is, of course, if you have too much potassium or you're over applying beyond what you need, or you're not using those split applications, you can see again how it impacts the uptake of these other critical nutrients. So, here's just an example where you can see on the bottom 300 pounds of or kilograms of potassium per hectare were added. And you can see the decline in the uptake of these other nutrients, again, because there's a ton of potassium there and the plants, it's going to outcompete the other nutrients into the plants. The other thing I wanted to mention is, and I've highlighted this a bit, but there's a lot of interconnection between these different nutrients. And when you're looking at your soil tests and you see that you need nitrogen and you need phosphorus and you need potassium, and you just figure, well, I can get nitrogen pretty easy, and that's what I normally put on. I'm just going to go with that, and I'll meet the nitrogen needs of my crops, and I guess I'll just, overlook the potassium for this year. And you probably learned about this, in school way back when, or even more recently for some of you. But if you're deficient in one nutrient and you've added all the other ones to the level that they're needed, you're still not going to be optimizing the productivity of your plants, right? Whether it's quality or yields or health of those plants, because, it's kind of like saying, well, I'm just going to take a vitamin C because I heard that was good for me, but I ignored all the other vitamins. And so my hair is falling out because I actually needed something else and I didn't take care of that. It's not any different. So if you look at this graph, you can see on the bottom, these are various levels of nitrogen. And I want to make this point between the uptake of nitrogen into your plants and the uptake of potassium. They're actually really closely linked. And so you can see if I don't add any potassium and I add 440 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, you can see my yield potential here is quite low. So I basically have blown a bunch of money on fertilizer and I'm still not getting a return because I didn't add the potassium that the crop needed, right? So again, the take-home message here is, if it says your crops need nutrients, you need to add those. It's not like one or the other, because adding all of something but ignoring everything else still may not give you the results that you're looking for. And ultimately, you're wasting money or wasting, manure, whatever it is. It's all money. Okay, so, on the other side, you can see if you add too much potassium and not enough nitrogen, same kind of thing. So as far as managing potassium levels and forages, this discussion comes up every year, at least when we met in person. People will say, well, my soil test always calls for potassium, but I have high potassium feed. How is that possible? Well, guess what? It clearly is possible. And it has a lot to do of when that potassium that you do put on is available to those crops. So again, if you're adding potassium every year because your soil test says to, but you're putting it all on in one lump, right, and not spreading it out, you could still be getting forages that are too high in potassium. Again, you have that flush of potassium in the spring. So usually our first cut, especially if it's harvested really lush, can be very, very high in potassium because of that. And then the potassium levels go down over time. So, the luxury consumption is a real thing. It can really impact the amount of potassium in your crops. And then the stage of maturity and the time of year. So of course, as the crops become more mature, the amount, not necessarily the amount of potassium goes down, but the concentration relative to the amount of biomass goes down. And then the time of year, like we talked about. There's a difference between species. This is some old work that was done by Jerry Cherney at Cornell, but I wouldn't say that it's, overly significant, to justify changing, what you grow to manage potassium. 11 o'clock. So I just wanted to quickly go over some of the micronutrients. And I will say, UVM doesn't necessarily give micronutrient recommendations. We do for certain ones, which I've already mentioned, boron and zinc in particular. Now, that's not to say that others could or could not be deficient. And I think just knowing the scenarios where micronutrient application might be warranted or important is good information to have when you're trying to decide, if you should be purchasing micronutrients or not. So again, remember, just looking at the charges can help you understand a bit about nutrients that could become deficient very quickly, especially in light textured soils. So molybdenum is one of them, boron, chlorine, and boron in particular here has been noted to be deficient in soils. Here's various crops and their affinities for certain micronutrients, not just affinity, but needs. So some crops have higher micronutrient needs than others. And this table just tries to highlight that a bit. So you can see alfalfa has a high need for boron and other legumes as well, other forage legumes. Manganese needs are generally high in some of the small grains and soybeans, that's associated with nitrogen fixation. And you can see corn usually has a high need for zinc. So just kind of knowing if your crop does have a high affinity for some of these micronutrients can help you keep an eye on things that maybe you'd otherwise overlook. As I mentioned before, these are critical, so you want to make sure that you have micronutrients in your soil because it will impact, if you don't, the overall productivity of the plant. But that line between, not enough and too much is pretty fine because they're micronutrients. They're needed in really small amounts. So this just sort of highlights that. The difference between sufficiency and excess is pretty small. So how do you diagnose micronutrients? And like I mentioned before, we don't just give out recommendations. We do for boron and zinc. You can use a soil test for manganese and come up with some recommendations as well. But most micros are really done through plant analysis at different stages, especially. And if this is something you're interested in, we can dig into it more for the particular crop. But, most crops have various pieces or parts and growth stages that they need to be sampled at to identify a micronutrient analysis. So again, when do you want to consider applying micronutrients is, if the crop requirement is really high and the soil test level is really low, obviously. And also, again, in Vermont, we know that certain crops or certain nutrients become deficient really easily. And I kind of reiterate that around boron. We give an actual blanket recommendation because of that. Now, I've talked quite a bit about soil conditions that are prone to micronutrient deficiency. And I had mentioned a few times that if you have, sandy soils with really low organic matter levels, you might want to be looking at adding a micronutrient pack, especially if you're not applying manure on a regular basis. So the manure that we have, if your animals are, well, if they're eating, which I'm sure they are. I just read last night to my son, what's that book? Everyone Poops. Anybody know that book? It's a great book. A one hump camel has a one hump poop, and a two hump camel has a two hump poop. Nobody's read that book. Maybe next week we'll have story time here in nutrient management class, and we'll read the book Everyone Poops. There's nothing in the chat. Nobody has ever read that to their child. It shows all the different poops. No? Okay. Where am I going with this? Oh, yeah. The last part of the book says, everyone eats, so everyone poops. So the point here is, if your cows are getting micronutrients, you're giving them minerals, plus all the other feed that they're eating, grain in particular, as well, then they're going to be excreting micronutrients that you're putting back on your fields, which is generally why we don't get too worried about it. But not everybody has manure, and not everybody puts it on every field every year. And you know, people grow other crops that don't require manure and are on sandy soil. So it's definitely not to say that we couldn't have a deficiency. Now, of course, there's other, you know, pH levels we talked about impacting micronutrient and nutrient availability. So if you have, you know, really high pHs, you can run into some issues where you may need to add micronutrients. And so just kind of understanding those conditions could help you gauge, you know, if you should be adding a micronutrient pack or not. Magnesium, I already mentioned quite a bit. Again, you know, critical nutrient. We do see deficiencies in Vermont. If you see magnesium needs on your soil tests, you need to add it. It can be quite harmful, again, to the crops and to the plants or into the animals. And you can see it's influenced, again, by these other nutrients. We just talked about this. So if you're really out of balance here, need to make sure that you're adding that magnesium so that your plants have access to it. All right, so we already covered that. Grass tetany. Again, if a lot of you are grazing farms, and I'm sure you've probably dealt with this in the spring. Already covered this as well. All right, sulfur deficiency, same kind of thing. We started hearing more about sulfur deficiencies or concerns around them, especially as we started to solve the acid rain issues. You know, we used to actually say the acid rain provided us with all the sulfur we needed on our soils. So there was no need to add any. You know, it is a critical component to, you know, many proteins and obviously lots of other functions in the plant. I have seen, you know, I think once, maybe twice, a deficiency in Vermont, but it does happen. Again, thinking about the conditions where it might happen. You can see here, again, those kind of sandy soils, low organic matter, high rainfall, and little or no manure amendments or compost, other organic amendments that might have sulfur in them. Okay. So again, sulfur is very similar, you know, in a lot of ways to nitrogen. And, you know, it's actually pretty closely related to nitrogen in a lot of ways, and a lot of the ways that it functions in the soil. So again, it can be lost quite easily, and, you know, lots of microbial conversions going on here with this particular nutrient. So again, just thinking about if you might need to be adding sulfur. Some people use sulfur-based fertilizers. So, you know, that's another way to sort of combat this if you're having issues. If you're organic, you know, there are options there as well. Not the same ones that many conventional farmers can use, but there still are options. A lot of the times we'll identify sulfur deficiencies by doing plant analysis, like I mentioned, and there's specific times that you should be doing these. And there are ranges that are identified. So if you think you have a sulfur deficiency, or maybe just want to check, you know, using plant analysis is usually kind of the best way to do this. Zinc deficiencies in corn. Like I said, this can occur and does in Vermont. You can make a recommendation, look on the soil test. Don't just add it because you think you should, or that's what you've always been doing. If you're looking for ways to save money, this might be one. You know, it's not I mean, it can be a problem in corn, but not always. You can see some of the conditions where we might see issues with zinc deficiencies. All right. So we already talked about this, making recommendations from the soil test. And then lastly, the boron deficiency. I'm sure most people have seen this. I see it all the time, you know, just sort of reddening of the plant leaves in particular. Now, some people confuse boron deficiency with leafhopper issues, which we've had a lot of over the last few years. I think I used to have a picture in here, but yep, there we go. So we've had really terrible leafhoppers. Last year was not as bad. The year before it was horrible, where, you know, you might have seen your alfalfa or your legumes just turn this bright yellow. Oh my gosh. And generally that's, you know, not always, but it is from leafhoppers, especially when you see it kind of in the month of June into early July. They cause this hopper burn, it's called. So you kind of see this V shape here. And that's actually from these pesky little leaf hoppers that are blown up into our state anyway in storms. And they can be really bad and cause a ton of damage on alfalfa in particular, but also other legumes. Boron deficiency, you can see over here to the left, you do get some of that yellowing, but you also get some of the reddening as well. Very different than hopper burn. If you are planting, you know, alfalfa and pure stands of alfalfa in particular, you really should be considering using a leafhopper resistant variety. It's not a GMO either, so you know you can use them if you're organic as well. And you know, it's really the leafhopper resistant alfalfa. It's really hairy. And the leafhoppers don't like the hairs. I mean, that's the basic mechanism. And Sarah and I, who's on this call, we had a legume trial for the last number of years. During those years where we had terrible leafhoppers, and that leafhopper resistant alfalfa was the only thing standing out in that field. It was amazing to see how well it tolerated leafhoppers. And in this particular, at least in our research plots, it was the difference between having feed and not. And I'm sure many of you that have battled leafhoppers over the last few years have also lost significant yield from them. So, you know, getting those leafhopper resistant varieties can really pay. All right. Manganese, especially in soybeans, people are growing soybeans more often these days. And I have seen manganese deficiencies here in Vermont in soybeans. I've seen it on down in Addison County in particular. I know a few of you are down there. So, you know, think a bit about if you need to be adding some manganese. Definitely could help the productivity of those soybeans for sure. It's just a picture of some of the deficiency in soybeans. It also can be an issue in small grains. I haven't seen that as such here, but I've definitely seen issues in soybeans. So something to keep your eye out for. This is in dry beans, kidney beans. So you can see snap beans too. If you're growing snap beans on a vegetable farm, can be a real issue. You can see it in corn too, but not as often. Okay. We have started to, I shouldn't say started, we have seen reports, has been pretty well documented that there often can be a linkage between manganese deficiency and Roundup Ready soybeans or glyphosate resistant soybeans. So just something to think about. Again, if you're on a susceptible soil type, susceptible conditions, then those kind of deficiencies can be further exacerbated with glyphosate resistant soy. Right. So just a few other pictures. I mean, it's easy, I will say, to go out in a field and see a little yellowing and get on the internet and start going, oh my gosh, it's, you know, it's this, it's that. It's kind of like self-diagnosing yourself when you get sick. It's like, oh my gosh, I've got this, it must be this. So, you know, just be cautious. If you need help identifying something, please reach out. so that we can assist. You know, you don't want to misdiagnose something and, you know, end up adding a micronutrient that you didn't need and, you know, hurt the plants. So, all right. So again, paying attention to that pH is really important. We've talked about this a lot. pHs, you know, especially outside of the Champlain Valley, can be quite low. So, you know, if you're going to invest some money, this is a good place to do it. Wood ash, you know, people have varying opinions about wood ash, but it might still be, you know, readily available, relatively inexpensive. And wood ash itself has a lot of these micronutrients in it, plus potassium and the calcium that is needed to shift the pH. So that could be, you know, it's a local source of nutrients and lime, and can be a really good way to, you know, increase micronutrients, increase pH, and meet the needs of your crops. I hear it a lot from people. Oh, I used wood ash, and oh, you wouldn't believe the clover I had. Well, you know, you're giving the clover everything that it really wants, right? Wood ash is pretty high in potassium, calcium, boron, manganese. So, you know, it's a good fertility source that we have around us. All right, so I'm going to end on that for today. Stop that.